So I put a little bit of synthetic grease into that slot there and here. Just checking the arms on this door to make sure they're not unusually shaped. They should just sit in there like that. Now we had spacer washers. Putting one at the top, and in this case I'm putting the thicker one at the top, and the two thinner ones I'll put at the bottom. And get the hinge pin screw in place. Flip the camera over, gather up my two other washers, slide them into the space between the door and the frame. The hinge screw runs through them. Do that up. That opens and shuts nicely. So we got that part of the job done. Next I need to deal with the bits and pieces for the film advance. I usually start by dealing with the lock lever and release lever. So I'll apply a bit of molybdenum paste into the two holes at the top of the casting, the two holes at the bottom of the casting, the guide hole for the lock lever, and rub some in here for where the spring will ride for the release lever. First I need to true up the spring a bit for the release lever. It's not lying all in one plane. Yeah, it just sprung away. Where is it? There it is. If I leave it like that, it'll be inclined to come loose. That time it did get away. Let me find it. Well, I spent 10 minutes searching the room for that. Turns out it was still on the bench. It hadn't gone far at all. Springs, eh? Everyone's favourite. Let's get this hooked into position while the going's good. There we go. I'll get this in position on the camera. Drop that in from the bottom, being careful not to catch the spring on anything and bend it up out of shape. Since just like that, since I've just spent 5 minutes straightening it out. Now the two screws that look much the same, the heavier one is the one that does this job. The lighter one goes on the lock lever. See if we can get this screw started. Yes. I'll run that screw in a bit further than that. It's probably a good place to start. The lock lever next, I'll drop that in place in the body. Yeah, holding that up from underneath, I'll put its spring in place. It's the lighter of the two springs. I'll hold that compressed with my thumb while I fit the retainer clip, little E clip or C clip. Press that into position. Right, so I've got my levers in place in the bottom of the camera. And I can prepare the film advance shaft. I'll lubricate the film advance shaft with some graphite grease where the shaft goes through the bush. This assembly is all riveted together, so you're not getting it any further apart than it already is. Just making sure that that grease is worked in there. It feels good. And run some into the spring. Doesn't really require much, it just helps that spring revolve smoothly when it's under tension. Now I'm going to use some synthetic grease on the cam surfaces on that lever, that shaft. There are cam surfaces on both sides of the disc. One is for the advanced part of the motion, one is for the return part of the motion. Just checking that that's sitting neutral, that the spring's tucked in place. That looks fine. Got my film take-up spool. Fit the metal bush into the base of the take-up spool, the round hole, not the one with the slot on the top. Open the back of the camera, drop that into position, flip the camera over, put the film take-up shaft, the advanced shaft in place. Those levers swung back out of the way. That seems to be sitting correctly. I'll just check that the take-up spool moves freely on there, that the spring hasn't become dislodged and jammed it up. There are 3 screws that hold this in place. Nickel plated screws, same size as the ones that hold the chrome trim on the base plate. These ones are indistinguishable because they're all nice and clean, having been through the ultrasonic cleaner, through solvent and everything. But if you otherwise, you'd recognise these 3 screws because they were greasy, whereas all the other screws of the same type would have been covered in glue and remains of leatherette and possibly corrosion if you're extra lucky. That's the 3 screws in place. Now I need to assemble the clutch. The clutch I lubricate with graphite grease. And why graphite grease? Because I like it. The stuff that I've got here seems to work very well. If I didn't have it, I'd probably use something else. I've certainly used synthetic grease in the past for this particular task, but this stuff works good. So I've got to get this assembled, got to get the spring sitting correctly in its place. I hold that with a pair of crimp lug pliers gently. I can revolve that into place, pulling the spring into place, get the outer part of the clutch in place, slide it over the top, and there we have our clutch. It always revolves smoother in one direction than the other, and that's the right direction, so there's no problem there. Revolve this to engage with the slots in the top of the film cassette, film take-up spool, and we can fit the bush on the top of the film advanced shaft. So first I'm going to force some grease into that little gear there and run some round there outside the shaft. Now if I revolve that sprocket with my take-up spool with my thumb, that will help the gear here engage, and this will drop into place. Now our film advance is just revolved here and jammed up, so let me just get this back where it should be. And to stop that causing me grief, I'll put something underneath there to stop that pushing down. I was going to put that tripod sockets around underneath it, just so it doesn't run away. Get that back in place. Get this in place. That's it. Revolve that, everything goes exactly as it should do. Now this screw, that screw was bent. I'm going to find a replacement for that, or I might try straightening it. That little bush goes on there, it goes plain side up, countersunk side down. That little pawl goes on there, and the screw that holds that in place also holds a spring. I'll just run a little bit of grease around the top of that screw so that the pawl can revolve freely and get that in place. With that screw not picking up the hole. Oh, that's revolved, has it? Okay. Check that the pawl moves correctly, it appears to. And let me look at this screw. We'll put it in place to see how it behaves. Oh, it seems to be going in straight enough. I think we might be right with that. Just leave that where it is. We'll do that up. We need our return spring for the pawl. Get this in position. That goes round a groove in the top of that head of that screw. Yep, that's sprung loaded and it moves freely. The gear on the top of the film advance shaft goes now. I'll run a little bit of synthetic grease around the underside of that, underneath the rim and through the centre. If I rotate this anti-clockwise, it should just push the pawl out of the way and engage with the gear. It doesn't want to. Here we go. And the pawl's working nicely. There's a leaf spring arrangement that goes on here next. And I've always put a bit of grease on there, not because it needs to be lubricated so much as it needs to be a little bit of protection from corrosion is always good. That piece goes on. This drive dog goes on. We have a washer. We have our gear and the screw that holds it all together. And since that's the biggest screw, I don't know how it got away and hid. Right, I need to look at this gear because we know the rack was damaged. I need to look closely at the teeth of this gear and make sure that there is no damage on these teeth. Excuse me while I hold this up to the light. That looks okay. I'll put that in place. And in my tidying up, I have put the screwdriver that does this up out of reach. Now the lock lever will stop the shaft from turning, so I can tighten that screw up. If you overdo it, of course, you'll break the screw, and that would be a bother and a nuisance. So that's the advanced shaft in place. I want to get the lever, the lock for the rewind button in place next, so that's that. There's its screw, and there's its return spring. I normally lubricate the end of that lever with a bit of molybdenum paste on that curved end. Yeah, and I usually just put a wipe through the pivot for good measure. Slide that into position. Yeah. Nice, that not wanting to drop. Put its spring in place. And run the screw in. The screw's a shoulder screw. The spring runs around one shoulder. The lever runs around the other. Be careful you don't get the lever trapped underneath that thing, or you won't like it. Do that up. Now I just need to hook the spring back behind the lever. So I'm going to lift the tip of it and get it behind that lever, so that lever is now sprung loaded. I want the sprocket and sprocket shaft in here next. Well, here's our sprocket, slot side up, that goes in. And our sprocket shaft, I'll apply some synthetic grease to this, on the shaft towards the top, on the shaft towards the bottom, that's where it runs through the body casting. Normally I put just a tiny wipe on the teeth of the gear. Feed that in from the top. Comes down through the sprocket. Lines up at the base of the camera there. If I pull this lever back, there you can see it protrude through. If I rotate the spool slightly, it comes down full depth. I'll close the front of the camera so I can work comfortably. Now I've got to get the drive screw in place, the screw that couples the shaft and the sprocket together. Sometimes this goes in without a murmur, and other times it fights all the way. We'll see what today brings. It's going to be a bad day. Sometimes there's a better lead on one side of the shaft than the other, and you better to rotate it 180 degrees and you can get the screw in without any arguments. That might be what I'm going to do. Just rotate at 180 degrees and hope we've got a better lead in on this side of the hole. Yes, it starts. Right, knit that up. Rewind button next. Where are we? Still in camera? Only just. Okay. So, rewind button. It's washer and it's spring. I usually lubricate this with a bit of synthetic grease. Just put some in the spring. Put the rewind button through the spring. Put it through the washer. Screw that into the end of the sprocket shaft. Check that it will pass through the washer, that it's not, the shoulder hasn't tightened against the washer, it passes through it. That's good. And I'll tighten the button. You can tell how much to tighten because it hurts your thumb if you're holding the sprocket back with your thumb while you're doing that. So that's good, that's done. What else at the bottom of the camera? Well, we just about put the tension the film advance and put the base plate back on the camera. So I'll find all this nickel plated screws to hold that in place. Three, we've got 7 really, must be short one somewhere. There's another one. That looks good. Now this is a bit bent. It's not uncommon for this to be bent. Now it's probably from being thumped on the ground or on a table or something, and the chrome trim just takes a bit of a set. So I'm just trying to straighten that out a bit. Have the edge of this wooden block. See if I can get it to lie a bit flatter than that. Don't overdo it, because if you put a kink into it, you'll never ever get it to look right. That looks a lot happier. Before I put that in place, I will want my film advance lever all ready to go. And at the moment my film advance lever is nice and clean, but it lacks its rubber buffer, because that had gone all nasty and sticky and stuck to the camera, so I've got to get a replacement for that. I've got a bit of self-adhesive rubber here. I've cut a little thin piece out. See if we can get that fitted into the film advance lever. That down into position. That's good. I didn't cut it quite as tight as I should do, so I'll just trim the edge of that off now. That's fine, that's nice and neat. Okay, so what do I want to do here? Well, I want to get one full turn of tension on here so that the film advance lever returns to the park position. Let me get this propped up in a handy way. So if I hold back that, rotate this one full turn clockwise, drop that back into position, the lock lever drops in. Let's get my release lever tucked down correctly there. So I've got one full turn of tension on there. Now I've got to be very careful not to drop this down on the bench, because if the lock lever hits the bench, it'll lift, unlock that, and it'll all unwind, and I'll have to take this off and do it again. Get 3 screws in here. And get my film advance lever on there. Once the film advance lever is on there, it cannot unwind. Right, and just check the action of that. That seems to run nice and smoothly. So I'll get these remaining screws in the trim here on the base of the camera. That one's a bit ugly looking. Check those 4 screws are tight. That's good. Okay. That's the film advance at the bottom of the camera. Now at the top, this needs its shutter cocking rack now. We have a new shutter cocking rack to put in place. That's not it, because the old one's been through the ultrasonic cleaner. It looks shiny and new, but the teeth are mutilated. We'll put the new one on. Let's put some synthetic grease in there. It should be fine. The plate that holds it down, you need to put that in place. Now the post for the film release lever goes in here. That screws through there. I have to find the right tool for that. I can see it at the other end of the table. And the right screw should have a round head, nickel plated, and will probably have a chewed up thread at the end because of the way it sits. I think this one will do us nicely. Yeah, that'll be it. Right, let's check the action of that cocking rack. That's fine, actually that can come along another tooth, I would say. Let's just lift that screw up, move that rack 1 tooth further forward. And we'll try it there. When the chrome trim's in place, it might not clear properly. Now that looks okay. Where's my chrome trim? Here it is. Let's have a look at that. Yeah, that's a bit touch and go. We'll try something. See if I can move loosen these screws and move the whole shaft back very slightly. Depends how much play there is in the screws. I might get away with that. I'll put the strap lug on at this end and we'll find out shortly whether this is going to return nicely or whether it's going to grizzle, in which case I've got to pull that back one tooth. Yeah, it doesn't want to complete, so I've got to come back one tooth. Earlier cameras without the chrome trim here, you had more room to get the engagement there correct. And we'll put the strap lug back in place. And run a screw through the other position on the strap lug. That'll have to come out shortly because that would hold the meter in place. That'll give us a better idea of how this is working. Well, that's too tight. So it needs a spacer under here, a shim of some sort. Let's just slacken those two off. Yeah. It most certainly does. Let me have a look at that. I may have to adjust the position here so this may be too tight. Let's see if I can loosen this screw off and its mate. Pull this shaft across. Tighten those screws up and see how it goes. It seems to be looser. Sometimes you've got to muck about a bit to get the best possible fit. Yeah, that appears to be better. And if you don't do that, you could be creating problems for yourself. Yeah, it doesn't want to complete. That screw definitely needs a spacer, a shim washer under there. I'll just go and find one.